Okay, and so in this video, we're going to look at a revision summary of the UK executive. So, what is the role of the Prime Minister? Well, the Prime Minister is the head of the UK executive branch, and so they are the executive head. They bring together policy and government administration, and essentially they are responsible for everything that happens within the context of government and parliament. They architect of policy, so they lead on development and shape that kind of legislative agenda both domestically and internationally, and they have a primary role in representing the UK on the global stage, negotiating treaty, foster alliances, schmoozing other world leaders, and so on and so forth. In terms of power, how do they carry out these roles? Well, they direct policy. They're the key decision makers in terms of domestic and foreign policies. They chair cabinet, they lead the cabinet, so they're the leader of the government, even though in theory they are first amongst equals. And they have the authority to appoint ministers and engage in kind of key administrative direction. They get all of this power from the constitutional role that they're given, but also the leadership of their party. Fundamentally, they are the leader of the largest party, and as the leader of the largest party, in a democratic system whereby a decision is made by the number of MPs that vote for it, if you have a majority within Parliament, because you're the leader of the largest party, then you're going to win the vote in Parliament, so you should, in theory, be able to pass legislation that you want, as long as all of the MPs within your Parliament support you, and that is what whipping is all about. And so alongside the Prime Minister is supported by the Cabinet. And the role of the Cabinet is very much around forming that policy, supporting the Prime Minister in their decision-making, and coordinating the different areas of government. Now, a number of different cabinet ministers that sit within the cabinet, and each one of them, yes, is responsible for decision-making on a kind of wider government scale, but also the running of a particular department. So you have the Minister for Health, you have the Minister for Education, and the Minister for Foreign Affairs. And so all of these different ministers are responsible for kind of the running of government within their particular departmental area. They approve policy, they control the budget, and they have, some of them, the powers around the national security and respond to key events. They represent the Prime Minister when he's not there or in areas that he's not able to be, and they derive a lot of that responsibility from him. So how does the Cabinet limit the Prime Minister? Well, the Cabinet limits the Prime Minister through collective decision-making. They have these Cabinet meetings and they are able to discuss and debate at these Cabinet meetings the key things. It's possible for Cabinet members to dissent, not publicly because of, individual ministerial responsibility, which we'll talk about a bit later. But it is possible, and we saw this with Boris Johnson, that when a number of kind of cabinet ministers and key figures come out and resign, they can have a really big impact in undermining the Prime Minister. And arguably, that in the end was the downfall of Boris Johnson's premiership. However, the Prime Minister has a huge amount of control over the cabinet. Firstly, the Prime Minister sets the agenda for Cabinet meetings. So the Prime Minister controls how often those Cabinet meetings are, how long they happen, and what issues are put onto the agenda and what in order they're discussed in. So if you're a Prime Minister that wants not really that much influence from what your cabinet and doesn't really care what they say, you have a half-hour meeting once every 2 weeks, and you chuck loads of stuff in there so that they don't have lots of time to discuss the nitty-gritty. But some prime ministers want to have that round table of advice and guidance, so they'll spend hours in cabinet discussing various things to be able to get a range of different viewpoints. It depends on how the prime minister wants to lead their government. The Prime Minister also controls the Cabinet because they have the power to appoint them. So if a Prime Minister is of that ilk where they want their voice to be the loudest voice, what they'll do is they'll appoint ministers to the government that agree with them and are arguably essentially just yes men. They'll also control those individuals by the ability to get rid of them if they don't like what they're doing. And so sometimes you'll find that there are government reshuffles that strategically move people who maybe have been outspoken against the Prime Minister into other slightly less important areas of government that have less focus because the Prime Minister doesn't feel that they're being as effective as he or she wants them to be. And then the Prime Minister sets the overall policy direction. So whilst the Minister might be the person who works out the nuts and bolts and how something is to be done, it's the Prime Minister who sets the intention. And so if the Prime Minister, I don't know, for example, highlights immigration and controlling immigration as being an important thing and then gives that to the Home Office Minister, the Home Office Minister can't turn around and go, no, I think that we should have less controls over immigration, because the Prime Minister is setting out that strategic direction for the Minister to work within. So in these ways, yes, there are ways in which the Cabinet can hold the Prime Minister to account. However, the Prime Minister has a lot of very stringent controls over how different Cabinet Ministers run, particularly in terms of the overall message and the importance of various aspects. So, talking about collective and individual ministerial responsibility. Collective ministerial responsibility is an important principle whereby Cabinet members all collectively agree on decisions and policies of the government. And so the point is that you wouldn't expect a Cabinet Minister to come out of Cabinet and go onto a TV show and moan about something that they'd happened and say that they disagreed with it. This is also true of votes. So Cabinet Ministers under collective ministerial responsibility can't vote against legislation that is proposed by the government. So if a Cabinet Minister feels so strongly, like David Blunkett in 2004 did and Esther Vey did in 2018, against the government's agenda, then they have to resign their ministerial seat to be able to vote in the way that they feel fit. And so there are a number of instances, those are but two, of ministers who've made the decision to resign in order to be able to talk openly and disagree with the government. You also have this concept of individual ministerial responsibility. And it's twofold. Firstly, it's about individual ministerial responsibility for their department. So, for example, in 2019, after the COVID situation with the exam grades and the mutant algorithm, it was deemed by the Prime Minister that Gavin Williamson was culpable for the poor running of the Department of Education. And therefore, he was resigned over this issue of individual ministerial responsibility. So the first part is individual ministers' responsibility to run effectively their departmental area. And if that's not the case, then they are expected to resign. However, the other aspect of individual ministerial responsibility is that ministers work within what is called the Ministerial Code of Conduct. And the Ministerial Code of Conduct governs how a minister should behave. And it's about them behaving appropriately and professionally. And so, for example, in 2021, Matt Hancock being caught in a compromising position with his aide could be deemed against the Ministerial Code of Conduct, undermining his position as a minister, and therefore you might say that he resigned under this idea of individual ministerial responsibility because he wasn't upholding his role as a minister and the expectations around that in the way that it should be. So the executive within the UK is a hugely powerful body because within the executive, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet hold supreme authority over the Parliament, and the Parliament is sovereign. Because if you are a Prime Minister and you, therefore, as Prime Minister, have a majority of votes in the House of Commons, in the House of Commons, you have the power after the Parliament Act of 1949 to push through pieces of legislation, even though the House of Lords disagree, and no monarch has ever kind of refused to sign since 1707, then really, as the Prime Minister, you can really force through legislation if you so wish. And here are three examples. So in 1990, Margaret Thatcher led the charge on the very unpopular poll tax policy. In spite of public opposition and protest, this still went through. In 2003, Tony Blair used his significantly sizable majority to arguably push through the invasion of Iraq and commit British military forces, even though there were significant public protests and international concerns. And in 2020, the power of the UK government, led by Boris Johnson, negotiated the terms of a treaty to bring about Brexit. Now, what's interesting about that last example with the power of the executive was that Brexit was something that Theresa May, with a small majority, failed to be able to pass. So Theresa May, who was the Prime Minister before Boris Johnson, was unable to get a Brexit deal on Britain's exit from the European Union. That was because, partially, she had a very slim majority in the House of Commons. So she couldn't guarantee that enough MPs were going to vote for her withdrawal agreement. And so she brought forward to Parliament a number of withdrawal agreements that were unsuccessful. In 2019, Boris Johnson becomes leader. The first thing he does, or one of the first things he does, is has a general election. The outcome of that general election was that the Conservatives won a significant majority of seats with a mandate to get Brexit done. And so this kind of altogether really pushed this issue of Brexit up the agenda, gave them a really strong mandate, and meant that Boris Johnson had the numbers in Parliament to be able to push through this withdrawal agreement. And so what we see are these three individuals having significant power. But the commonality between Margaret Thatcher, between Tony Blair, and between Boris Johnson in these three governments is the size of their majority. Yes, a Prime Minister is very powerful. However, the Prime Minister's power rests in the size of their majority within the House of Commons. And all three of these Prime Ministers executed their power very effectively. However, what they also had was a very sizable majority in the House of Commons. So therefore, they had a number of MPs that they could guarantee were likely to vote for pieces of legislation that they put forward, even if these pieces of legislation were not necessarily the most popular thing. So finally, how does the legislative body scrutinise the work of the executives? Well, firstly, Prime Minister's questions or Minister's questions. Prime Minister's questions happens on a Wednesday at 12 o'clock every week. And it provides direct accountability and public exposure. It's on TV, it's on the internet. And however, it only provides a very limited time. And it's often very highly orchestrated and curated. And I think there's question marks around how effective it is as a method of scrutiny, because the reality is most people look at it and just see a bunch of men shouting at each other. You've then got select committees, and select committees provide scrutiny within Parliament on lots of different areas, and they provide those specialist expertise. They have the ability to call witnesses and scrutinise the work of different government departments based on evidence and outcomes. However, they have constraints on their resources. They're not able to, use exponential amounts of resources and money to bring about their decisions. So if you are a government, you might choose to constrain the resources of certain select committees in areas where you know that there might be questions. And then debates and votes in Parliament. Fundamentally, for a bill to pass into a law, and therefore for statute law to change and be introduced, it needs to go through Parliament, where there is a comprehensive examination and opportunity for amendments, yes, from MPs within Parliament, but also from peers in the House of Lords. However, this is highly impacted by partisan dynamics. If you are a Conservative MP and a Conservative Prime Minister is putting forward a piece of legislation, if you want to be successful in that Conservative Party, you're not incentivized to greatly challenge that piece of legislation. And so party loyalty is really, really important. And because party loyalty is really, really important, the Prime Minister, as the leader of the party, holds a lot of those cards and a lot of that power. The Prime Minister employs in the legislature a number of whips whose job it is to convince MPs from their own party to vote in a particular way and support the case. And so when we think about ministers, there are key roles. So you've got the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Foreign Secretary, and the Home Secretary, those grand officers of state. And the role of ministers within the cabinet are to formulate policy, to manage their department, and to represent individuals, their individual constituents in Parliament. Now, the executive. In one hand, the Prime Minister is technically first among equals. He is the leading, or she is the leading MP. But in reality, has significantly more power than that, particularly if, as we've seen, they have a large majority. If they have a large majority, if Tony Blair had a 197 seat majority in 1997, and what that meant was for a piece of legislation proposed by Tony Blair not to go through, 100 of his MPs had to vote against it to be able to turn it around. And that's something that's really, really unlikely, especially considering the pressures that there are for MPs to vote in line with their parties. And on that basis, in the UK, many people would argue that the executive branch is really, really very powerful.